The last thing Matilda heard before the door slammed shut was her father's voice, thick with whiskey and contempt. "Let the blizzard have you both." Then there was only white silence and the terrified whimper of the puppy clutching to her chest. My lovely family, before we begin Matilda's story, I need to tell you something. If you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or cast aside like Matilda, then please hit that subscribe button. Subscribe so that stories like hers will reach the world. It takes 2 seconds, costs you nothing, and it ensures that stories like hers, stories about survival and love against impossible odds, actually reach the people who need them most. Don't let the algorithm bury her story the way her father tried to bury her. England, 1824. The wind howled around the stone corners of Longbrook Manor like a living thing seeking entrance, a mournful, shrieking beast that rattled the loose window panes in their rotting frames. Inside the library, the air was only marginally warmer than the blizzard raging outside. The fireplace, vast enough to roast an ox, held only a pathetic pile of smoldering peat that offered more smoke than heat. Lady Matilda Vance stood before the heavy oak desk, one hand clasped tightly against her chest, where a small terrier puppy trembled beneath the fold of her shawl. At 22, she had long since learned that showing fear to her father was like bleeding in water filled with sharks. Yet the instinct to shiver was born of the bone-deep cold that permeated the house, rather than cowardice. She wore a nightgown of thin linen that had been mended so many times, the fabric had grown translucent at the shoulders. It was a garment fit for sleep in a warm bedchamber, not a confrontation in a freezing library. But in this decaying mausoleum of a home, propriety meant little against the crushing weight of debt. The Earl of Longbrook sat slumped in his leather chair, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. The drink was the only thing of quality left in the house, purchased on credit that had long since run dry. His face was flushed, the capillaries broken across his nose and cheeks, a map of his vices. And his eyes, once sharp, were now glassy and swimming with intoxicated malice. He slammed the glass down, the sound echoing sharply in the cavernous room. "You will do as you are told, Matilda," he slurred, the words thick but heavy with threat. "I have not kept you fed and housed all these years for you to develop a spine now. Mr. Grimwald has been generous, exceedingly generous. He is willing to overlook your age and your tarnished reputation, and he requires no dowry." Matilda felt the bile rise in her throat. She kept her chin lifted, her dark eyes burning with a defiance she had nurtured in silence for 2 years. Beneath her shawl, Pip let out a soft whimper. "Mr. Grimwald is a monster, father." His creditors whisper that his last wife disappeared without a trace. He is 70 years old and he smells of rot and cruelty. I will not marry him. I would rather take service in a scullery. The Earl laughed, a harsh grating sound that turned into a wet cough. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Service." He spat the word like a curse. "You are the daughter of an earl. You have a duty to this name. Do you think I care about your delicate sensibilities? Grimwald holds the notes on this house, on the land, on the very chair I sit in. He has offered to forgive the debts in exchange for you. It is a transaction, girl. Nothing more. I am not a piece of livestock to be bartered to a butcher, Matilda said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. The puppy stirred against her ribs, a warm reminder of what little innocence remained in her life. Sell the paintings. Sell the silver that is left. But do not sell me to a man who will see me dead within the year. The Earl's expression darkened, the drunken humor vanishing instantly. He stood, swaying slightly, his shadow stretching long and distorted against the wall. The paintings are gone. The silver is gone. Everything is gone except you and that filthy animal you insist on coddling like a child. His eyes fell on the small bulge beneath her shawl, and his lip curled in disgust. "That mangy beast," Lord Edmund hissed, lurching forward and jabbing a finger toward her chest. "I told you to drown it weeks ago. It eats food we cannot afford. It dirties the carpets. It is a waste, just like you." Matilda's arms tightened protectively around Pip. "He is the only loyal thing in this house, Father. He has done nothing to deserve your cruelty." "Loyalty?" Edmund barked a bitter laugh. "Loyalty does not pay creditors, girl. Loyalty does not keep the roof over our heads." He staggered closer, his breath reeking of whiskey and decay. "You will sign the contract tonight. You will marry Grimwald at week's end, and you will dispose of that wretched creature, or I will do it myself." "No." The word was barely a whisper, but it rang through the library like a bell. Lord Edmund went very still. His face, already flushed with drink, turned a mottled shade of crimson. "What did you say?" Matilda's heart hammered against her ribs, but she held his gaze. "I said no, Father. I will not marry him, and I will not harm Pip." For a moment, there was only silence, save for the wind's relentless howl and the puppy's soft, anxious panting. Then Edmund moved. He closed the distance between them in 2 staggering steps, his hands shooting out to grip her arm with bruising force. Matilda gasped, clutching Pip tighter as her father wrenched her toward the library door. "You ungrateful, insolent wretch," he snarled, his voice shaking with rage. "You think you have a choice? You think you can defy me?" "Father, please." But there was no mercy in his eyes, only the cold, vicious satisfaction of a man who had already decided her fate. He dragged her through the darkened corridors of Longbrook Manor, past the empty rooms and covered furniture, past the portraits of ancestors who had once been proud. Matilda's bare feet slipped on the icy floorboards. Pip yelped as she struggled to keep him shielded from her father's fury. And then they were at the front door. Edmund threw it open, and the blizzard roared into the hall like a demon unleashed. Snow swirled in a violent white storm, and the cold hit Matilda like a physical blow. "No, Father, please," she cried, her voice lost in the wind. But Lord Edmund, the Earl of Longbrook, the man who had sired her and claimed dominion over her life, shoved her forward with all the strength of his rage. Matilda stumbled down the front steps, her thin nightgown no defense against the brutal cold. She fell to her knees in the snow, Pip tumbling from her arms with a sharp cry. Behind her, the door slammed shut with a finality that echoed louder than thunder. The lock turned, and the world became nothing but white and cold, and the desperate, frightened whimpers of a puppy who did not understand why the warmth had gone away. Matilda crawled forward, her fingers numb and clumsy, and gathered Pip back into her arms. She pressed him against her chest, trying to shield him with her body as the wind tore at her hair and the snow blinded her eyes. She tried to stand, but her legs would not hold her. The cold was already seeping into her bones. "This is how it ends," she thought distantly, not in violence, not in scandal, but in silence and snow. Pip licked weakly at her chin, his small body shivering violently. "I'm sorry," Matilda whispered, her lips blue and trembling. "I'm so sorry, Pip." She curled around him, giving him what little warmth she had left, and the blizzard swallowed them whole. The cold was a living thing that crawled beneath Matilda's skin, burrowing into her flesh with claws of ice. She could no longer feel her feet. Her hands had gone from numb to burning, to nothing at all. The thin linen of her nightgown clung to her body, soaked through with snow that melted against her skin, only to freeze again in the relentless wind. Pip had stopped whimpering. That terrified her more than anything else. The small terrier lay pressed against her chest, tucked beneath what remained of her shawl, his tiny body still warm, but growing frighteningly still. She tried to whisper to him, to offer some comfort, but her lips would not form the words. Her breath came in shallow, labored gasps that burned her lungs. The road stretched endlessly before her, a ribbon of white disappearing into the howling darkness. She had crawled perhaps 20 yards from the manor gates before her strength had finally abandoned her. Now she lay curled on her side in the snow, her arms wrapped around Pip, her vision blurring at the edges. She thought of her mother, dead these 10 years. She thought of warmth. She thought of summer days when the world had not been made of ice and cruelty, and then she thought of Julian. The memory came unbidden, sharp and painful as a knife between her ribs. Julian Ashford, Duke of Alderridge, with his storm-gray eyes and his honorable, uncompromising heart. The man she had loved. The man she had destroyed. Better he remember her as cold and mercenary than know the truth, she thought. Better he live his life hating her than be ruined by association with her father's crimes. The darkness crept closer, soft and almost kind. Pip stirred weakly against her chest, and she felt the hot sting of tears freeze on her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she breathed, the words barely a whisper lost to the wind. "I'm so sorry." And then she heard it. The muffled thunder of hooves, the jingle of harness, the creak of carriage wheels cutting through snow. She tried to lift her head, but her body would not obey. Her vision swam, and she saw only vague shapes moving through the white, dark forms against the blizzard, tall and imposing. A voice cut through the storm, sharp and commanding. "Stop the carriage!" Footsteps crunched through the snow, quick and purposeful. A shadow fell over her, blocking the wind for one blessed moment. Good God! The voice was familiar, achingly, impossibly familiar. Strong hands gripped her shoulders, turning her gently onto her back. She forced her eyes open, blinking against the snow, and found herself staring up into a face she had not seen in 2 years. Julian Ashford, Duke of Alderridge, looked down at her with an expression that might have been carved from the same ice that was killing her. His dark hair was dusted with snow, his greatcoat billowing around him like the wings of some avenging angel. But it was his eyes that struck her. Those gray eyes she had once thought held warmth now blazed with something cold and terrible. Recognition and fury. "Lady Matilda," he said, her name clipped and precise as a blade. "Of all the roads in England, you choose mine to die upon." She tried to speak, but no sound came. Her lips moved soundlessly, and she felt the horrible, creeping shame of her helplessness. Julian's jaw tightened. He looked away from her, his gaze sweeping over her prone form with clinical detachment, and then stopped. What in God's name? He reached down and carefully pulled back the edge of her shawl. Pip lay nestled against her chest, his small body shivering violently, his dark eyes wide and frightened. For a moment, something flickered across Julian's face, surprise perhaps, or the ghost of some gentler emotion. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "A dog," he said flatly. "You are freezing to death in a blizzard, and you are clutching a dog." "Please," Matilda managed, the word barely audible. "Pip!" "Be silent," Julian commanded, though his tone was not cruel, only coldly efficient. He turned his head and called over his shoulder. "Andrews, blankets and a warming brick, quickly!" A servant appeared beside him, a wiry man with anxious eyes who moved with practiced speed. He draped a thick woolen blanket over Matilda's body while Julian carefully extracted Pip from her arms. "No," Matilda gasped, panic giving her a momentary surge of strength. "Please don't hurt him." Julian's eyes snapped back to hers, and the ice in them deepened. "I am not a monster, Lady Matilda. Whatever you may have thought of me, the animal will be cared for." He handed Pip to Andrews with surprising gentleness, murmuring instructions too low for Matilda to hear. Then he turned back to her, and without ceremony, he slid his arms beneath her and lifted her from the snow. She was weightless in his grip, fragile as a bird, and the warmth of his body was so overwhelming after the cold that she could not suppress a shuddering gasp. She felt his arms tighten fractionally around her, and then he was moving, carrying her toward the carriage with long, swift strides. "Why?" he asked, his voice low and hard. "Why were you on the road? In this storm? In a nightgown?" Matilda's head lolled against his shoulder. She tried to answer, but the words tangled in her mind, slipping away like water through frozen fingers. Julian made a sound of disgust. "Of course. No explanation. There never is with you, is there?" He climbed into the carriage with her still in his arms and laid her on the cushioned bench with more care than his tone suggested. Andrews appeared a moment later with Pip wrapped in a scrap of flannel, the puppy's nose just visible above the fabric. "Put the creature by the warming brick," Julian ordered, "and make haste. We need to reach the hunting lodge before she succumbs to the cold entirely." Andrews obeyed, settling Pip into a small nest of blankets near a heated brick wrapped in cloth. The puppy whimpered softly, but did not struggle. Julian took the seat opposite Matilda, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. He did not look at her directly. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on some point beyond the carriage window as the vehicle lurched into motion. "I will take you to my lodge," he said, his voice clipped and formal. "You will be tended to by my housekeeper. When you have recovered sufficiently, you will provide an explanation for this spectacle. And then you will leave." Matilda's eyes fluttered closed. She wanted to thank him. She wanted to explain. She wanted to tell him that she had never stopped. "Do not mistake this for kindness, Lady Matilda," Julian continued, his tone as cold as the storm outside. "I act only out of duty. I would not leave even my worst enemy to freeze in the snow. But make no mistake. You lost any claim to my concern the day you made it abundantly clear that my fortune and title were insufficient for your ambitions." The words struck her like blows, each one precise and deliberate. She opened her mouth to protest, to defend herself. But the darkness was rising again, warm and soft and irresistible. The last thing she saw before unconsciousness claimed her was Julian's face, hard and beautiful and utterly unforgiving. And the last thing she felt was the terrible, aching knowledge that he hated her, and that she deserved it. Matilda woke to warmth. It was such a foreign sensation after the biting cold that for a moment she thought she had died and passed into some kinder realm. But then pain bloomed through her extremities, a fierce, burning ache in her fingers and toes that made her gasp. And she knew with bitter certainty that she was still very much alive. She opened her eyes to find herself in a bedchamber she did not recognize. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and a fire roared in the hearth with such vigor that the room was almost stifling. Heavy curtains were drawn against the windows, but she could hear the wind still howling outside, a distant reminder of the storm that had nearly claimed her. She was lying in a large bed beneath a mountain of quilts and furs. Her nightgown had been removed, replaced by a soft linen shift that smelled faintly of lavender. Her hair, still damp, had been braided loosely over one shoulder, and curled in a tight ball on the pillow beside her head was Pip. The puppy's eyes opened at her movement, and his tail gave a single, tentative wag. He made a soft sound, half whimper, half greeting, and pressed his cold nose against her cheek. "Pip," Matilda breathed, her voice hoarse and raw. She lifted one trembling hand to stroke his head, and the relief that flooded through her was so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "You're safe. Oh, thank God." "He has not left your side since we arrived." Matilda's head snapped toward the voice, and she found Julian standing near the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, his posture deceptively casual. He had removed his greatcoat and wore only his shirt and waistcoat, the sleeves of his shirt rolled to his elbows. The firelight cast his face in sharp relief, all angles and shadows. He did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the flames. "Mrs. Dawson, my housekeeper, attempted to remove him so she could tend to you properly," Julian continued, his tone flat and emotionless. "The creature growled at her, a dog no larger than a boot, growling at a woman twice his size. She was quite put out. Despite everything, the pain, the fear, the humiliation, Matilda felt a weak smile tug at her lips. He is very protective." "So it would seem." Silence fell between them, thick and suffocating. Matilda pulled the quilts higher around her shoulders, suddenly aware of how improper the situation was. She was alone in a bedchamber with a man, dressed in little more than a shift, and that man was Julian Ashford, the Duke of Alderridge, the man whose proposal she had rejected with words designed to wound. "Your Grace," she began, her voice trembling, "I must thank you." "Do not." The word was sharp, cutting through her attempted gratitude like a knife. Julian finally turned to look at her, and the coldness in his eyes made her breath catch. "Do not thank me, Lady Matilda. Do not apologize. Do not offer me any of the pretty lies I am certain you have prepared. I saved your life because it was the right thing to do, not because I harbor any tender feelings toward you." Each word landed like a stone, heavy and deliberate. Matilda felt her throat tighten. "I understand." "Do you?" Julian took a step toward the bed, his expression hard. "Do you understand what it was like to find you on that road? To see you half frozen, clutching that animal as though it were the only thing tethering you to this world? To wonder what could possibly have driven you to such desperation? Your Grace." "And then to remember," he continued, his voice dropping to something low and dangerous, "that you are the same woman who informed me 2 years ago that my estate was insufficient, my title too new, my fortune too modest to meet your expectations, that you required a husband of greater consequence." Matilda closed her eyes, the shame washing over her in waves. "I never said—" "You said enough." Pip, sensing the tension in the room, sat up on the pillow and fixed Julian with a steady, unblinking stare. Then, to Matilda's horror and astonishment, the puppy stood, stretched, and leaped from the bed. He landed with an audible thump on the floor, wobbled for a moment, and then trotted directly toward Julian. "Pip, no!" Matilda tried to sit up, but her body was too weak, and she fell back against the pillows with a gasp. Julian looked down at the puppy with an expression of profound disbelief. Pip sat at his feet, tail wagging, and tilted his head in a manner that could only be described as expectant. "What does he want?" Julian asked, his voice tight. "I don't know," Matilda admitted. He's never done this before." Pip barked once, a sharp, insistent sound, and pawed at Julian's boot. Julian stared at the dog as though it had personally affronted him. "I am not a servant to be summoned by a creature that weighs less than a sack of grain." Pip barked again, more urgently this time, and then sat back on his haunches, his tail sweeping across the floor in broad, hopeful arcs. For a long moment, Julian did nothing. He simply stood there, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. And then, with a sigh that sounded like the surrender of a man facing an enemy he could not defeat, he crouched down. "You are an absurd animal," he muttered. Pip's tail wagged harder. He leaned forward and licked Julian's hand. Julian went very still. He stared at the puppy, and something in his expression shifted, something small and almost imperceptible, like the first crack in a sheet of ice. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and scratched behind Pip's ear. The puppy made a sound of pure contentment and leaned into the touch, his eyes half closing in bliss. Matilda watched from the bed, her heart twisting in her chest. She had seen Julian like this once, before, years ago, when the world had been simpler and his smiles had come easily. Before she had broken everything between them. "He trusts you," she said softly. Julian's hand stilled. He straightened abruptly, his expression shuddering once more. Animals are poor judges of character. But he did not move away, and when Pip trotted back to the bed, Julian's gaze followed the puppy with something that was not quite indifference. Mrs. Dawson appeared in the doorway, a tray of broth and bread in her hands. She was a stout woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air, and she clucked her tongue when she saw Matilda awake. "There now, my lady. You gave us quite a fright. His Grace carried you in himself, he did, and would not let anyone else tend to you until he was certain you were breathing proper." Matilda's eyes widened, and she looked at Julian. He turned back to the fire, his posture rigid. "Mrs. Dawson exaggerates." "I do not, Your Grace, and well you know it." The housekeeper set the tray on the bedside table and gave Matilda a kind smile. "Now, my lady, you must eat. Slowly, mind. Your stomach will not take kindly to haste." Matilda accepted the broth with trembling hands, and Mrs. Dawson bustled about, adjusting the quilts and adding another log to the fire. Pip climbed back onto the bed and settled himself at Matilda's side, his eyes fixed on Julian. Julian remained by the hearth, his back to them all, his silence a wall that could not be breached. But when Matilda glanced at him, she saw that his hand was still resting on the mantel, and his fingers were curled tight, as though he were holding something back. And she wondered, with a terrible, fragile hope, if perhaps the ice had not frozen all the way through, after all. The following 2 days passed in a fog of pain and recovery. Matilda's body slowly remembered what warmth felt like, though the burning ache in her fingers and toes remained a constant companion. Mrs. Dawson visited regularly with broths and tisanes, clucking over her like a mother hen, but it was Pip who proved to be her most devoted nurse. The little terrier refused to leave her side, except for the most necessary of reasons. He slept curled against her ribs, his small body radiating warmth. When she woke gasping from nightmares of cold and her father's fury, Pip was there, licking her face until the panic subsided. And Julian watched. He did not visit her chamber again after that first night. But Matilda knew he was aware of everything that transpired within it. Mrs. Dawson reported to him regularly. Matilda heard the low murmur of their voices in the corridor outside her room. And sometimes, in the early morning hours, when the lodge was still and silent, she thought she heard footsteps pause outside her door before moving on. On the third morning, Matilda woke feeling stronger. The pain in her extremities had diminished to a dull throb. and she was able to sit up without the room spinning. Pip, sensing her improved state, wagged his tail with enough vigor to shake his entire body. "You need to go out, don't you?" Matilda murmured, stroking his head. "Poor thing. You've been so patient." She pushed back the quilts and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet touched the cold floor and she winced, but she forced herself to stand. Mrs. Dawson had left a wool dressing gown draped over a chair, and Matilda wrapped herself in it, grateful for its warmth. Pip barked softly and trotted to the door, looking back at her expectantly. Yes, I'm coming," Matilda said, though her legs trembled with the effort of walking. She made it to the door and opened it carefully, peering out into the corridor. The hunting lodge was smaller than she had imagined, built for function rather than grandeur. The corridor was narrow and dim, lit by weak sunlight filtering through windows at either end. She could hear the distant clatter of pots from what must be the kitchen, and somewhere deeper in the lodge, the low rumble of a man's voice. Julian. Matilda's heart clenched. She had not seen him since that first night, and part of her was grateful for the reprieve. But another part, a treacherous, foolish part, ached at his absence. Pip barked again, more insistently, and she forced herself to focus. "The door must be this way," she murmured, following the puppy down the corridor. She found it at the end of the hall, a heavy wooden door that led to a small rear courtyard. The snow had stopped falling, but the world outside was blanketed in white, pristine and blinding in the morning sun. Matilda opened the door just enough for Pip to squeeze through, and the puppy bounded into the snow with joyful abandon. She stood in the doorway, shivering despite the dressing gown, and watched him play. He leaped through the drifts, his small body disappearing and reappearing like a fish breaching water. The sight brought the first genuine smile to her lips since the night her father had thrown her out. "You should not be out of bed." Matilda spun around, her hand flying to her chest. Julian stood in the corridor behind her, his expression unreadable. He wore riding clothes, and his dark hair was slightly disheveled, as though he had just come in from outside. Pip needed," she stammered, gesturing toward the courtyard. Julian's gaze moved past her to where the puppy was attempting to catch snowflakes on his tongue. Something flickered in his eyes, amusement, perhaps, or exasperation, but it was gone before Matilda could name it. "The animal could have waited until Mrs. Dawson took him out," Julian said. "You are still recovering. You should be resting." "I've rested for 2 days," Matilda replied, lifting her chin despite the weakness in her legs. "I cannot lie abed forever." "You can lie abed until you are fully recovered," Julian countered. "Or do you intend to collapse again? I assure you my patience for rescuing you has reached its limit." The word stung, but Matilda forced herself not to flinch. "I did not ask to be rescued, Your Grace." "No," Julian said quietly, his eyes darkening. "You merely threw yourself into a blizzard and waited to die. A fine distinction." Matilda looked away, unable to meet his gaze. In the courtyard, Pip had stopped playing and was watching them through the open door, his tail still wagging but his posture alert. Julian was silent for a long moment. Then he said, his voice carefully neutral, "Why the dog?" Matilda blinked. "I beg your pardon? Why risk your life for the animal?" Julian gestured toward Pip. "Mrs. Dawson tells me you would not eat until she assured you the creature had been fed first, that you gave him the warmest part of the bed, that you argued with her when she suggested he might be more comfortable in the kitchens." Matilda's throat tightened. "He is all I have." The words came out before she could stop them, raw and honest and far too revealing. Julian's expression shifted, something unguarded passing across his face. "All you have," he repeated slowly. "What of your father? Your family?" Matilda's hands clenched in the fabric of her dressing gown. "My father is the reason I was in that blizzard, Your Grace. He is the reason I had nothing but Pip." She saw Julian's jaw tighten. He took a step closer, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to retreat. "Explain." "I cannot. Matilda." Her name on his lips was a command, stripped of formality, and it shook her to her core. "What did he do to you?" Before she could answer, Pip barked sharply from the courtyard. Matilda turned, intending to call him back inside, and the movement caused the sleeve of her dressing gown to slip down her arm. Julian's hand shot out, catching her wrist with surprising gentleness. "Wait." Matilda froze. She looked down and saw what he had seen, the bruises that ringed her forearm like a bracelet, purple and green and yellow, the unmistakable shape of fingers pressed into flesh. "What is this?" Julian demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Matilda tried to pull away, but his grip tightened fractionally, keeping her in place, not hurting but not releasing. "It's nothing," she whispered. "It is not nothing." Julian's other hand reached for her left arm, and before she could protest, he pushed back that sleeve as well. More bruises, these darker and more vicious. And higher up, near her shoulder, the fading yellow shadow of what could only have been a blow. Julian went utterly still. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, and it shook with a fury so cold it burned. "Who did this to you?" Matilda could not answer. The words lodged in her throat, tangled with shame and fear and the desperate need to protect him from the truth. But she did not need to answer. She saw the understanding dawn in his eyes, saw the moment he connected the pieces, the blizzard, her nightgown, her father's name, unspoken between them. "Edmund?" Julian said, and the name was a curse. Matilda pulled her arms free and wrapped them around herself, hiding the evidence of her father's cruelty. "Please, Your Grace. Do not what?" Julian's voice was sharp now, all pretense of coldness shattered. "Do not acknowledge that you were beaten? That you were thrown into a storm to die? That you clutched a puppy and prioritized his life over your own because he was the only creature in your world who showed you kindness?" Each question struck her like a blow, and she felt tears prick her eyes. "You don't understand. Then make me understand," Julian said. He stepped closer, and his presence was overwhelming, all restrained fury and anguished confusion. "Make me understand why the woman I thought was cold and mercenary is standing before me covered in bruises, half-starved, and more concerned for a dog than for herself. Make me understand why you rejected me with words designed to wound and then ended up on a frozen road with nothing but a puppy and a death wish." Matilda shook her head, the tears spilling over now. "I cannot or will not. Both," she whispered. Julian stared at her, his chest rising and falling with barely controlled emotion. And then, to her shock, his expression softened, just slightly, just enough to let her see the man beneath the duke. "You protected him," Julian said quietly, his gaze dropping to where Pip sat in the doorway, watching them. "Even when it cost you everything." "He is innocent," Matilda said, her voice breaking. "He does not deserve cruelty." "Neither do you." The words hung between them, simple and devastating. Matilda looked up at Julian and saw something in his eyes she had not seen in 2 years. Doubt. Doubt about the narrative he had built around her. doubt about his own certainty, and beneath the doubt, the first fragile stirrings of something that looked like understanding. The peace of the hunting lodge shattered 3 days later with the thunder of hooves and the sharp rap of a fist against the front door. Matilda was in the small sitting room, Pip curled contentedly in her lap, when she heard the commotion. The puppy's head shot up, his ears pricked forward, and a low growl rumbled in his small chest, a sound she had only heard him make once before, in her father's presence. Her blood turned to ice. She heard Mrs. Dawson's voice in the entrance hall, high and agitated, and then another voice that made her stomach twist with dread. Deep and slurred and full of righteous indignation. Lord Edmund Vance, Earl of Longbrook, had found her. Matilda stood on trembling legs, Pip clutched to her chest. She wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The lodge was small, and her father's voice was growing louder, filling the space with the particular menace of a man who believed himself entitled to everything he touched. "I will see my daughter," Edmund roared. "I am her father and her legal guardian. You have no right to keep her from me, woman." "His Grace is not receiving visitors," Mrs. Dawson replied, her tone admirably firm despite the circumstances. "You will have to return at a more suitable. I will not be dismissed by a servant. Where is the Duke? Where is my daughter?" Footsteps echoed in the corridor, sharp and purposeful, and then Julian's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "That is quite enough, Lord Edmund." Matilda moved to the doorway of the sitting room, staying just out of sight, and peered into the entrance hall. Her father stood near the door, his greatcoat dusted with snow, his face mottled with drink and fury. Beside him stood a thin, pale man in a dark suit clutching a leather satchel, a bailiff or solicitor by the look of him. And between them and the rest of the house stood Julian, dressed impeccably, despite the early hour. His posture relaxed, but his eyes cold and hard. "Your Grace," Edmund said, sketching a bow that was more mockery than respect. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I have come for my daughter. I have been informed that she is residing here, in your care." He invested the word with enough insinuation to make it an insult. Julian's expression did not change. "Lady Matilda is indeed under my protection." "Protection," Edmund repeated, his lip curling. "A curious word for it. I was not aware that unmarried young women were in the habit of staying unchaperoned at the hunting lodges of bachelor dukes." "Your awareness, or lack thereof, is of no consequence to me," Julian replied coolly. "Lady Matilda was found on the road during the blizzard, half frozen and near death. I provided her with shelter and medical care, as any man of honor would do." "How very noble," Edmund sneered. "And yet, she remains here, days later, unchaperoned, compromised." He leaned forward, and his voice dropped to something ugly and calculated. "I wonder what the gossip columns would make of such a situation, Your Grace. A young woman of good family, ruined by a duke's hospitality. It would be quite the scandal." Matilda's breath caught. She saw Julian's hands clench at his sides, the only outward sign of his anger. "You dare to threaten me in my own home," Julian said softly, and the quiet menace in his voice was far more terrifying than any shout. "I dare to protect my daughter's reputation," Edmund countered, "and my rights as her father. Mr. Hemming here has been kind enough to bring the relevant documents." He gestured to the thin man beside him, who opened his satchel with trembling hands and produced a sheaf of papers. "This is a writ of guardianship," the solicitor said in a reedy voice. "Lord Edmund is Lady Matilda's legal guardian until such time as she marries or reaches the age of 25. He has the right to determine her residence and her future. Any interference with that right is—" I am aware of the law, Mr. Hemming, Julian interrupted. I am also aware that a father's rights are not absolute. They can be challenged on grounds of abuse or neglect. Edmund's face darkened. You would not dare. Would I not? Julian took a step forward, and Edmund actually retreated. Tell me, Lord Edmund, how did your daughter come to be on that road? In the middle of a blizzard? Dressed only in a nightgown? She is headstrong and foolish, Edmund blustered. She ran away in a fit of temper. She was thrown out, Julian said, his voice like iron. She bears the bruises of your hands on her arms. She was locked out of her own home and left to die in the snow. Those are not the actions of a protective father, Lord Edmund. They are the actions of a monster. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the solicitor looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting between the two men. Edmund recovered first, his expression twisting into something vicious. Slander, he spat. You have no proof of these wild accusations. And even if you did, it would not change the law. She is mine by right. Now summon her, or I will retrieve her myself. You will do no such thing. She is my property. She is my ward. The words rang out with absolute finality. Edmund stared at Julian, his mouth opening and closing, like a fish gasping for air. Your ward? He repeated. As of this moment, yes, Julian said. He turned to Mrs. Dawson, who stood wide-eyed near the stairs. Mrs. Dawson, please fetch writing materials. I will draw up the documents immediately. You cannot simply claim guardianship, the solicitor began. Can I not? Julian turned his cold gaze on the man. I am the Duke of Alderridge. Lady Matilda is currently residing under my roof, under my protection, having been rescued from mortal peril. Her father has demonstrated himself unfit through his actions. I have both the legal right and the moral authority to assume guardianship, particularly given that Lady Matilda is well past the age of majority in matters of personal welfare. She is not yet 25, Edmund protested. She is 22 and of sound mind, Julian countered. Old enough to enter a convent, to work as a governess, to manage her own affairs with the support of a suitable guardian, which I am offering to be. Matilda pressed her hand to her mouth, her heart pounding. She could not believe what she was hearing. Julian was claiming her as his ward, binding himself to her legally, putting himself between her and her father's wrath. Edmund's face had gone purple with rage. This is absurd. You have no grounds. I have every ground, Julian said quietly. And if you wish to challenge me, Lord Edmund, I suggest you consider very carefully whether you want the circumstances of your daughter's injuries examined in a court of law. I am quite prepared to bring witnesses. Mrs. Dawson saw the bruises. My physician documented them, and I have several servants who can testify to Lady Matilda's condition when she arrived, half frozen, traumatized, and clutching a small dog for comfort. The dog! Edmund seized on this, his eyes lighting with malicious triumph. That filthy mongrel! She stole it. It belongs to the estate. The dog belongs to me, Julian said flatly. Edmund blinked. What? The terrier is mine, a rare hunting breed I acquired last month. I had temporarily loaned him to Lady Matilda for companionship. When she was cast out, she naturally brought my property with her. I am grateful to her for protecting the animal at great personal cost. Matilda nearly laughed. The lie was so audacious, so perfectly delivered, that even she almost believed it. Pip, as if sensing he was the subject of discussion, poked his head around her skirts and wagged his tail. Edmund's mouth worked soundlessly. The solicitor looked at his papers as though they might provide some answer to this madness. "This is preposterous," Edmund finally managed. "You cannot." "I can, and I have," Julian said. He accepted the writing materials from Mrs. Dawson and moved to a small table near the window. "Mr. Hemming, you may witness the documents if you wish to be useful. Otherwise, you may leave." The solicitor hesitated, then scurried over to Julian's side, clearly deciding that the Duke of Alderidge was a safer patron than a debt-ridden earl. Edmund stood in the center of the hall, shaking with impotent fury. His eyes swept the room and landed on Matilda, half hidden in the doorway of the sitting room. "You," he snarled, "you ungrateful wretch. You have destroyed me. You have ruined everything." Julian's head snapped up. "One more word to her, Lord Edmund, and I will have you thrown out into the snow. Let us see how you enjoy the hospitality you showed your own daughter." Edmund's mouth snapped shut. For a moment, he looked as though he might charge forward. But something in Julian's eyes stopped him. "You will regret this," Edmund said, his voice shaking. "Both of you. I will see you ruined." "You have no power here," Julian said quietly. "You are a bankrupt earl with more debts than honor. I am a duke with the favor of the crown and the resources to bury you so deep in scandal you will never see daylight again. If you value what remains of your reputation, you will leave now and never return." Edmund stared at him for a long, terrible moment. Then he spun on his heel and stalked toward the door, his solicitor scrambling to follow. At the threshold, he turned back. "She is poison, Your Grace. She will destroy you, just as she destroyed me." And then he was gone, the door slamming behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. The silence that followed was deafening. Julian remained at the table, his pen still in his hand, his shoulders rigid. Mrs. Dawson bustled away, muttering about tea and nerves. Matilda stood frozen in the doorway, Pip warm and solid in her arms, and tried to comprehend what had just happened. Julian had saved her, again. Not out of duty this time, but out of something else, something fierce and protective and utterly terrifying in its implications. She took a hesitant step forward. "Your Grace." Julian looked up, and the expression on his face stole her breath, raw and unguarded, and full of an emotion she dared not name. "You are safe now," he said quietly. "Both of you. And despite everything, despite the past, despite the lies, despite the wreckage between them," Matilda believed him. "My beautiful family. If you're feeling anything right now, anger at Edmund, relief that Julian stepped in, hope that Matilda might finally be safe, then pause for just a moment. Hit that subscribe button. I know it seems small, but here's the truth. It tells YouTube that this story matters, that stories about broken people finding protection and love deserve to be seen. If you don't subscribe, the algorithm assumes you don't care, and it stops showing these stories to others who desperately need them. Please, one click, that's all it takes. Let's get back to the story. The storm that had raged outside the lodge for days finally broke that evening, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to press against the walls. Matilda stood at the window of the sitting room, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Pip slept on the cushion behind her, exhausted from a day spent exploring the lodge under Mrs. Dawson's watchful eye. She heard Julian enter before she saw him. His footsteps were quiet but unmistakable, and she felt her entire body tense in anticipation. "You have been avoiding me," he said without preamble. Matilda did not turn from the window. "I have been recovering, Your Grace, as you instructed." Do not dissemble, Matilda. You avoid me when I enter a room. You take your meals in your chamber. You have not spoken more than 10 words to me since your father left. She closed her eyes. It was true, of course. Since the confrontation 3 days ago, she had done everything in her power to stay out of Julian's path. The weight of what he had done, claiming her as his ward, lying to protect Pip, standing between her and her father's fury, was too much to bear. It sharpened the guilt that had lived in her chest for 2 years into something so acute she could barely breathe around it. I did not wish to impose further on your kindness, she said quietly. Kindness. Julian's laugh was bitter. Is that what you think this is? He moved closer, and she could feel his presence like heat at her back. When he spoke again, his voice was low and rough. I need to know, Matilda. I need to understand why. Her hands gripped the window frame. Why what, Your Grace? Do not play the fool. It does not suit you. His reflection appeared in the glass beside hers, his face drawn and haggard in the fading light. 2 years ago, you rejected my proposal. You told me that my fortune was insufficient, that my title was too newly acquired, that you required a husband of greater consequence and older lineage. And I believed you. God help me, I believed every word. Matilda felt tears prick her eyes. Your Grace. But the woman who said those words, Julian continued, his voice rising, does not exist. I see that now. That woman would not risk her life for a puppy. That woman would not bear bruises in silence. That woman would not look at me the way you do, as though I am something precious you have no right to touch. Please, Matilda whispered, do not do this. Then tell me the truth. Julian's hand appeared beside hers on the window frame, so close she could feel the warmth of his skin. Tell me why you lied. Tell me why you sent me away. Tell me why I have spent 2 years hating you, when every instinct I possess is screaming that I should have fought harder to understand. The tears spilled over now, hot against her frozen cheeks. She could not tell him. To tell him would be to expose the rot at the heart of her father's house, the scandal that would have destroyed everything Julian had worked for. It would be selfish and cruel, and he threatened you, Julian said suddenly, and Matilda's breath stopped. Your father? He threatened you with something. That is why you refused me. Matilda shook her head, but the denial was weak, transparent. Julian turned her to face him, his hands gentle but implacable on her shoulders. What did he threaten you with, Matilda? What could possibly have been terrible enough to make you choose a lifetime of abuse over a future with me? It was not about me, she choked out. It was never about me. Then what? Julian demanded. And there was anguish in his voice now, raw and desperate. What was worth sacrificing everything for? You. The word tore from her throat like a confession ripped from a prisoner. It was about you, Julian. It was always about you. He went very still. His hands remained on her shoulders, but she felt the tremor that ran through him. Explain. Matilda drew in a shuddering breath. The truth sat on her tongue like poison, bitter and burning, but she was so tired of carrying it alone. When you proposed to me, you had only just inherited the dukedom. Your uncle's death was sudden, and there were those who questioned the circumstances. Julian's jaw tightened. There was an inquest. I was cleared of any suspicion. I know, Matilda said quickly. I know you had nothing to do with it. But my father knew things. He had evidence, letters, documents, that could have called the verdict into question. False evidence, manufactured by his associates, but convincing enough to create a scandal. Enough to have the title challenged, the inheritance frozen, your reputation destroyed. She watched the color drain from Julian's face as understanding dawned. He threatened to use this evidence if you married me. He threatened to use it if I did not refuse you publicly, cruelly enough to ensure you would never seek me out again, Matilda corrected, her voice breaking. He said that if I rejected you with sufficient venom, if I made it clear that I found you beneath me, you would hate me enough to stay away. And if you stayed away, if there was no connection between our families, he would have no reason to destroy you. Julian's hands fell from her shoulders. He took a step back, and the loss of his touch was physically painful. You lied to protect me. I lied to protect your future, Matilda said. You had just inherited a dukedom, Julian. You had responsibilities, estates, people depending on you. My father's evidence would have ruined everything. It would have dragged you through courts and scandal sheets. It would have tainted your name forever. She wiped at her tears with shaking hands. I could not let that happen. Not when I had the power to stop it. By destroying yourself, Julian said, and his voice was hollow. By condemning yourself to years of abuse and isolation. By making me believe you were something you were not. It was the only way, Matilda whispered. He made it clear that if I told you the truth, if I sought your help, he would release the evidence immediately. The scandal would have been worse if it appeared we were conspiring together. So I did what he asked. I said the words that would make you hate me, and I prayed that you would forget me and build the life you deserved. Julian turned away from her, his hands rising to grip his hair. She could see the tension in every line of his body, the way he seemed to be holding himself together by sheer force of will. And the puppy? The question was so unexpected that Matilda almost laughed. What? Pip, Julian said, still not looking at her. Where does he fit into this tragedy? I found him last winter, Matilda said softly. Abandoned in the snow, half-starved. My father wanted me to leave him to die. But I could not. He was so small, so helpless. He needed me. Her voice cracked. And I needed something to love that would not be taken from me. Something pure that had nothing to do with titles or money or my father's schemes. So you protected him, Julian said quietly. The way you protected me. It is not the same, is it not? Julian turned back to face her, and the look in his eyes was devastating. You sacrificed your happiness, your safety, your future, all to protect others. You took cruelty upon yourself so that a puppy and a duke might be spared. You are either the noblest woman I have ever met, or the most foolish. I am neither, Matilda said, her voice barely audible. I am simply someone who could not bear to watch the things I loved be destroyed. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sound of Pip's breathing from the cushion and the distant crackle of the fire. Julian stared at her as though seeing her for the first time, and she bore his scrutiny with what remained of her composure. I wasted 2 years hating you, Julian finally said, and the pain in his voice cut her to the quick. 2 years believing you were mercenary and cold. 2 years during which you were suffering. And I did nothing to help you. You did not know. I should have known, Julian said fiercely. I should have questioned it. I should have fought for you, investigated your circumstances, refused to accept your rejection at face value. But I was proud and wounded, and I let my pride blind me to the truth. There was no truth for you to find, Matilda said. I made certain of that. Julian crossed the space between them in 2 strides and took her face in his hands. The gesture was so sudden, so tender, that Matilda gasped. You made me believe a lie because you thought it would save me. But all it did was condemn us both to years of misery. I know, Matilda whispered, fresh tears spilling over his fingers. I know, and I am sorry. I am so desperately sorry, Julian. He pressed his forehead to hers, his eyes closing, his breath warm against her lips. Do not apologize for being brave. Do not apologize for loving me enough to let me go. The words broke something inside her, and she sobbed openly now, her hands clutching at his coat. Julian held her, his arms coming around her with a fierceness that spoke of all the years they had lost, all the pain they had endured. I never stopped, she confessed against his chest. I never stopped loving you, even when I knew I had no right to. Julian's arms tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Then we are well matched, Matilda, because I never stopped loving you either. I simply buried it beneath hatred and called it healing. She pulled back just enough to look at him, and what she saw in his eyes made her heart stutter. Not coldness, not contempt, but something fierce and tender and utterly undeniable. What do we do now? She whispered. Julian's thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, wiping away her tears. Now? Now I make certain your father can never hurt you again. And then, his voice softened, then we see if 2 broken people can build something whole. Julian left before dawn the next morning, taking with him a horse and a grim determination that seemed to darken the very air around him. He told Matilda only that he had business in London that could not wait, but she saw the cold fury in his eyes and knew that Edmund's reckoning had come. She spent the day in a state of anxious suspension, unable to eat, unable to rest. Pip sensed her distress and remained pressed against her side, his warm weight a small comfort in the face of her mounting dread. Mrs. Dawson tried to distract her with needlework and conversation. But Matilda could focus on nothing but the image of Julian riding through the winter landscape with vengeance carved into every line of his body. What if her father fought back? What if the scandal she had tried so desperately to prevent was unleashed anyway? What if Julian's attempts to protect her only brought about the very destruction she had sacrificed everything to avoid? The questions circled in her mind like vultures, and by the time evening fell, she had worn a path in the carpet with her pacing. Julian returned 3 days later, just as the sun was setting. Matilda heard the horse's hooves in the courtyard and rushed to the window, her heart in her throat. He dismounted with the careful movements of a man who had ridden hard and slept little, his face drawn and shadowed with exhaustion. But when he entered the lodge and their eyes met across the entrance hall, she saw something in his expression that stopped her breath. Satisfaction, cold, absolute, and utterly merciless. It is done, he said simply. Matilda descended the stairs on trembling legs, Pip trotting at her heels. What is done? Julian, what have you— Come, he said, extending his hand. We should speak in private. She took his hand, and he led her to the small study at the back of the lodge. A fire burned in the hearth, and papers were scattered across the desk, documents covered in dense legal script that made her head swim just looking at them. Julian poured himself a measure of brandy and downed it in one swallow before turning to face her. I went to London to see my solicitor, Mr. Pierce. I asked him to investigate your father's financial affairs and any evidence he might have manufactured regarding my uncle's death. Matilda's hands twisted together. And? And what I discovered, Julian said, his voice tight with controlled rage, is that your father is not merely a man burdened by debt. He is a criminal of the most calculating variety. He moved to the desk and picked up one of the documents, though he did not look at it. His gaze remained fixed on Matilda, as though he needed to see her face when he spoke the words. The evidence your father claimed to possess regarding my uncle's death was entirely fabricated. Pierce confirmed as much within hours. But that was the least of Edmund's sins. Julian set the paper down with careful precision. For the past 15 years, your father has been engaged in systematic fraud. He has forged documents to secure loans, manipulated land surveys to sell property he did not own, and embezzled funds from charitable trusts established by your grandfather. Matilda felt the blood drain from her face. 15 years? At minimum, Julian confirmed. Possibly longer. He has been borrowing against assets that no longer exist and selling debts to men like Grimwald. Men who care nothing for the law so long as they can extract what they are owed in flesh rather than coin. She sank into a chair, her legs no longer capable of supporting her. Pip jumped into her lap immediately, pressing his nose against her palm, and she clutched him like a lifeline. The evidence he threatened you with, Julian continued, his voice softening marginally, was a collection of forged letters purporting to show that I had conspired with my uncle's physician to hasten his death through the administration of certain medications. The physician in question has been dead for 18 months, conveniently unable to refute the claims. But Pierce traced the origin of the letters to a forger in Cheapside, who has worked for your father on multiple occasions. He planned it, Matilda whispered. He planned to blackmail you from the moment you proposed. Yes, Julian said flatly. He saw an opportunity to bind himself to a duke, either through your marriage, which would have given him access to my resources, or through blackmail, which would have given him power over me. When you refused him, he made certain you had no choice. Matilda pressed her hand to her mouth, nausea rising in her throat. I truly believed the evidence was real. He showed me documents, letters with your seal, forgeries, Julian said, all of it. But convincing enough to terrify a young woman who had no resources to verify their authenticity and every reason to fear what would happen if she challenged her father. He crossed to her and knelt before her chair, taking her cold hands in his. You sacrificed 2 years of your life for a lie, Matilda. You endured abuse and isolation and nearly died in the snow, all to protect me from a threat that never truly existed. The grief in his voice undid her. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she could not speak for the sob that caught in her throat. Julian's hands tightened on hers. The fault is not yours. It is his. Every moment of suffering you endured, every bruise on your skin, every nightmare that wakes you in the dark, all of it rests on Edmund's shoulders. And I swear to you, Matilda, he will pay for every single transgression. What have you done? She managed to ask. I have done what should have been done years ago, Julian said, his voice hardening to steel. Pierce has compiled a comprehensive dossier of your father's crimes. We have testimony from creditors, victims of his fraud, and the forger himself, who was more than willing to cooperate in exchange for leniency. We have financial records that prove Edmund has been operating a criminal enterprise under the guise of aristocratic privilege. He released her hands and stood, moving back to the desk. I presented this evidence to the Lord Chancellor this morning. By week's end, formal charges will be filed. Your father will be arrested for fraud, forgery, embezzlement, and conspiracy. If convicted, He faces transportation or imprisonment for the remainder of his natural life. Matilda could not breathe. The room seemed to tilt around her, and only Pip's solid warmth kept her tethered to reality. "You have destroyed him." "I have brought him to justice," Julian corrected. "There is a difference." "He is still my father," she whispered, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "He ceased to be your father the moment he struck you," Julian said, and there was no compromise in his tone. "He ceased to be worthy of that title the moment he locked you out in a blizzard to die. Whatever bond of blood exists between you, Matilda, he severed it long ago." She knew he was right. She had known it for years, perhaps. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the final, irrevocable judgment pronounced, left her feeling unmoored and strangely weightless. "What happens now?" she asked. Julian returned to kneel before her, and this time he cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Now, you are free. Truly free. Edmund will never touch you again. He will never threaten you, never manipulate you, never use you as a pawn in his schemes. The law will strip him of his title, his lands, and his liberty. And you?" His voice broke just slightly. "You will finally be safe." Matilda searched his face and saw not only determination, but something deeper. Grief. Not for Edmund, but for her. For the years she had lost. For the girl she had been before her father's cruelty had carved away her innocence. "I should have protected you sooner," Julian said, his thumb brushing away her tears. "I should have seen through the lie, should have investigated, should have refused to accept your rejection. I failed you, Matilda, and I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life." "No," she said, finding her voice at last. "You could not have known. I made certain you could not know. The failure is not yours, Julian. It never was." "Then we share it," he said quietly. "The guilt, the grief, the wasted years. We share them, and we vow to waste no more time." She leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his, Pip squirming between them with a soft whine. "What does that mean?" Julian's hand slid from her face to her shoulders, steadying her, anchoring her. "It means that I am going to spend every remaining day proving to you that you were worth fighting for, that you are worth everything. And it means that when your father's trial is concluded and you are legally free of his shadow, I am going to ask you a question I should have asked 2 years ago. And this time, I will not accept any answer, but the truth." Matilda's breath caught. She understood what he was offering, not just protection, not just vengeance on her behalf, but a future, a real future, built on honesty and trust and the love that had somehow survived 2 years of lies and separation. "I will answer truthfully," she whispered. "I promise you that." Julian smiled then, small and fragile but genuine, and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Then that is enough. For now, that is enough." The summons came on a gray morning 2 weeks later, delivered by a crown messenger whose livery gleamed even in the weak winter sunlight. Julian read the letter at the breakfast table while Matilda sat across from him. Pip curled contentedly at her feet and watched the subtle shift in his expression from grim satisfaction to something darker. "He has agreed to negotiate," Julian said, setting the letter beside his plate. "Your father wishes to discuss terms before the formal charges are filed." Matilda's hand trembled as she set down her teacup. "Terms?" "He knows he is cornered," Julian replied. "Pierce has been quite thorough in ensuring Edmund understands the full weight of the evidence against him. transportation to the colonies, if he is fortunate. The gallows, if the Crown decides to make an example of him. He is seeking a third option. Exile, Matilda said quietly. Julian's eyes met hers across the table. Yes. He wishes to propose exile in exchange for a full confession and the surrender of all claims to his title and properties. It is not uncommon in cases where the scandal might embarrass other noble families. And you will accept? That depends, Julian said carefully, on whether you wish to see him face trial or simply disappear from your life forever. Matilda looked down at her hands, still marked with the fading yellow shadows of bruises. She thought of her father's face mottled with drink and rage. She thought of the cold and the snow and the certainty that she was going to die. She thought of all the years of cruelty disguised as paternal authority. I want him gone, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath it. I want him so far away that I never have to fear his shadow again. If exile accomplishes that, then yes, let him take it. Julian nodded slowly. Then I will arrange a meeting. But Matilda, he paused, his expression serious. I want you there. She looked up sharply. What? No. Julian, I cannot. You can, he said firmly. And you should. He needs to see that you are no longer his to command. That you stand with me, protected and free. He needs to understand that every legal document he signs is witnessed by the daughter he tried to destroy. His voice softened. But if it is too much, if you truly cannot bear it, I will not force you. The choice is yours. Matilda drew in a shaking breath. Part of her wanted to refuse, to hide in the safety of the lodge while Julian dealt with her father. But another part, the part that had survived 2 years of lies and abuse, the part that had crawled through snow to protect a puppy, wanted to look Edmund in the eye one final time and show him that he had not broken her. I will go, she said. But Pip comes with me. Julian's mouth quirked in something that was almost a smile. I would not dream of separating you. The meeting was arranged for 3 days hence at a neutral location, the offices of Julian's solicitor in London. Edmund arrived with his own lawyer, a nervous young man who looked as though he would rather be anywhere else. And the moment Matilda saw her father step into the wood-paneled room, she felt Pip stiffen against her skirts. Edmund looked diminished. His face was gaunt, his clothes hung loosely on his frame, and the arrogant fury that had always animated him seemed to have drained away, leaving only a hollowed-out shell. His eyes found Matilda immediately, and something flickered in them. Rage, perhaps, or shame. But it died quickly when Julian moved to stand beside her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. Lord Edmund, Julian said, his voice cold and formal. Please, sit. Edmund sat heavily in the chair indicated by Pierce, the solicitor, who presided over the meeting with the grim efficiency of an executioner. The young lawyer beside Edmund shuffled papers nervously. You understand why we are here, Pierce began without preamble. The Crown has been presented with extensive evidence of your crimes, Lord Edmund. Fraud, forgery, embezzlement, conspiracy, and blackmail. The case against you is comprehensive and damning. You face arrest, trial, and in all likelihood, either transportation or execution. Edmund's hands clenched on the arms of his chair, but he said nothing. However, Pierce continued, His Grace the Duke of Aldridge has graciously proposed an alternative. You will sign a full confession to all charges. You will surrender your title, your lands, and all properties associated with the earldom of Longbrook. You will relinquish all legal claims to your daughter, Lady Matilda Vance, including guardianship, inheritance, and any future contact. In exchange, you will be permitted to leave England within 1 week and live out your remaining days in permanent exile on the continent. You will never return to England on pain of immediate arrest and execution. The silence that followed was suffocating. Edmund's face had gone ashen, his eyes darting between Pierce, Julian, and finally Matilda. "You would strip me of everything," he said hoarsely. "My title, my name, my daughter. You stripped yourself of those things the moment you chose criminality over honor," Julian said, his voice like iron. "This offer is more mercy than you deserve, and significantly more than you showed your daughter when you threw her into a blizzard to die." Edmund's gaze snapped to Matilda. "This is your doing. You poisoned him against me. You always were an ungrateful, vicious. Enough." Julian's voice cracked like a whip, and Edmund flinched. "You will not speak to her. You will not look at her. You have lost the right to acknowledge her existence." Pip growled softly from Matilda's arms, a sound so unexpected that even Edmund blinked. Pierce slid a stack of documents across the table. "These are the terms, Lord Edmund. You may review them with your counsel, but I advise you that the offer expires at sunset today. After that, the Crown proceeds with formal charges, and you take your chances with a jury." Edmund's lawyer leaned in and whispered urgently in his ear. Matilda watched her father's face cycle through emotions, rage, desperation, calculation, before finally settling on defeated resignation. "Where would I go?" Edmund asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That is no concern of ours," Julian replied. "You will be provided with a modest allowance sufficient to live quietly in whatever corner of Europe will tolerate you. But you will go, and you will never return." Edmund stared at the documents as though they were a death sentence. Perhaps in a way, they were. The death of his title, his legacy, his power, everything he had valued more than his own daughter. "If I sign," he said slowly, "she goes free?" "She is already free," Julian corrected. "She ceased to belong to you the moment I claimed her as my ward. This merely formalizes what is already true." Edmund's jaw worked. He looked at Matilda one last time, and she met his gaze without flinching. She felt Julian's hand steady at her back, felt Pip's warmth in her arms, and knew with absolute certainty that her father could never hurt her again. "Sign it," Edmund said to his lawyer, his voice hollow. The process took less than an hour. Document after document was presented, reviewed, and signed. Edmund's hand shook as he wrote his name, each signature a small surrender, until finally Pierce gathered the papers and locked them in a strongbox. "It is done," Pierce announced. "As of this moment, Edmund Vance is no longer the Earl of Longbrook. He has severed all legal ties to his former estates and to his daughter. The title will revert to the Crown for redistribution." Edmund stood slowly, moving like a man twice his age. He did not look at Matilda again. He simply turned and walked toward the door, his lawyer scurrying after him. At the threshold, he paused. "You will regret this," he said, though his voice carried no conviction. "Both of you." "The only regret I carry," Julian said quietly, "is that I did not destroy you sooner." Edmund flinched as though struck, and then he was gone, disappearing into the London streets like a ghost dissolving in daylight. Matilda stood frozen in the center of the room, Pip clutching to her chest, and tried to comprehend what had just happened. Her father was gone. Truly, permanently gone. She would never again hear his voice raised in anger, never feel his hand strike her, never wake in terror wondering what fresh cruelty the day would bring. She was free. The realization hit her all at once, and her legs buckled. Julian caught her immediately, his arms strong and sure around her, and she buried her face against his chest and wept. Not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming, almost painful relief of a burden finally lifted. "It is over," Julian murmured against her hair. "You are safe now. You are free. He can never touch you again." Matilda nodded, unable to speak, and felt Pip squirm between them, licking at her tears with gentle persistence. "Come," Julian said softly. "Let us go home." And for the first time in 2 years, Matilda knew exactly what home meant. Spring came late to the countryside that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the world around the hunting lodge into something almost unbearably beautiful. The snow melted away to reveal green shoots pushing through the earth. And the trees that had stood bare and skeletal for months began to blur with the soft haze of new leaves. Matilda stood in the small bedroom that had become hers and carefully folded the few garments Mrs. Dawson had procured for her into a borrowed traveling case. Her hands moved mechanically, her mind carefully blank, because if she allowed herself to think, to truly consider what she was doing, her resolve would crumble. It had been 3 weeks since her father's exile. 3 weeks of living under Julian's protection, eating at his table, walking the grounds with Pip romping at her heels. 3 weeks of carefully maintained distance, of polite conversation and averted eyes, of Julian treating her with unfailing courtesy and nothing more. He had fulfilled his promise. She was free, legally and entirely. Edmund would never return to England, and the scandal that might have erupted from the whole affair had been quietly managed by Pierce and the Crown. Matilda Vance was no longer the daughter of a disgraced earl. She was simply a young woman of no particular consequence, with no family, no fortune, and no prospects, which meant she had no reason to remain at the lodge and every reason to leave before she became more of a burden than she already was. Mrs. Dawson had helped her secure a position as a companion to an elderly widow in Bath. The salary was modest but respectable, and the widow had agreed to allow Pip to accompany her. It was more than Matilda had any right to expect, and she had accepted it with gratitude that felt like glass in her throat. She had not yet told Julian. The cowardice of it shamed her, but every time she tried to find the words, they died on her lips. How did one thank a man for saving your life, destroying your enemies, and giving you back your freedom? How did one explain that you were leaving because staying hurt too much? Because every moment in his presence was a reminder of what you could never have. She closed the traveling case and sat down on the edge of the bed. Pip, who had been napping on the pillow, raised his head and regarded her with dark, knowing eyes. "We are doing the right thing," she told him softly. "Julian has done enough for us. More than enough. We cannot impose on his kindness forever." Pip cocked his head, his expression skeptical in the way only a dog's could be. "He does not love me," Matilda continued, as though the puppy might argue. "He acts from duty and guilt. He blames himself for not seeing through my lies sooner, and he is trying to make amends. But once we are gone, he will be free to move on with his life. To find a wife worthy of his name. To forget about the foolish woman who caused him so much pain." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears, but she forced herself to believe them. It was easier than confronting the alternative that she was running away not from Julian's indifference, but from the terrible hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he might still care. She stood and picked up the traveling case, Pip jumping down to follow at her heels. The coach to Bath would depart from the village in 2 hours. If she left now, quietly, she could be gone before Julian returned from his ride. It was better this way. Cleaner. No tearful goodbyes, no awkward expressions of gratitude that could never adequately convey what she felt. She made it as far as the entrance hall before she heard his voice. "Going somewhere?" Matilda froze, her heart lurching into her throat. She turned slowly to find Julian standing in the doorway of the study, still in his riding clothes, his expression carefully neutral. But his eyes, his storm-gray eyes, were anything but calm. "Your Grace," she said, setting down the traveling case with trembling hands. "I did not hear you return." Clearly, Julian's gaze moved from her face to the case and back again. "You were planning to leave without saying goodbye." It was not a question, and Matilda could not lie to him. Not anymore. "I thought it would be easier." "For whom?" Julian asked quietly. He moved into the hall, each step measured and deliberate. "For me, or for you?" "For both of us," Matilda said, lifting her chin. "You have done so much for me already, Your Grace. You have given me my freedom, my safety, my life. I cannot continue to impose on your hospitality indefinitely. It is time I made my own way in the world." "I see." Julian stopped a few feet away from her, his hands clasped behind his back. "And where, precisely, do you intend to make your way?" "I have secured a position as a companion to a widow in Bath," Matilda said, proud that her voice remained steady. "Mrs. Dawson was kind enough to assist with the arrangements. The position includes room and board, and the lady has agreed to allow Pip to accompany me. It is a good situation." "A good situation," Julian repeated, and something dangerous flickered in his expression. "You are going to bury yourself in Bath as a paid companion, wasting your intelligence and spirit tending to someone else's vapors and complaints. And you call that a good situation?" "It is respectable employment," Matilda said, stung by his tone. "Not all of us have the luxury of choice, Your Grace." "Do you not?" Julian took another step closer, and Matilda's breath caught at the intensity in his eyes. "Do you truly believe you have no choice, Matilda? Or are you simply too frightened to claim the one you actually want?" "I do not understand." "Do you not?" Julian's control seemed to snap. He closed the remaining distance between them, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders. "Then allow me to clarify. You are leaving because you believe I saved you out of guilt, because you think my care for you is merely duty dressed up as kindness, because you have convinced yourself that I could not possibly want you to stay." Matilda's eyes burned with sudden tears. "And am I wrong?" "Yes," Julian said, and the word was fierce, absolute. "You are catastrophically, completely wrong." He released her shoulders only to cup her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. "I did not save you out of guilt, Matilda. I saved you because the thought of you dying in that snow nearly destroyed me. I did not pursue your father's ruin out of duty. I did it because the idea of him walking free while you bore the scars of his cruelty filled me with a rage I have never known. And I did not ask you to stay at this lodge out of obligation. I asked because I am a selfish man who cannot bear the thought of you leaving." "Julian," her voice broke on his name. "2 years ago, you broke my heart," he continued, his thumb brushing away the tear that spilled down her cheek. "You said words designed to wound, and they succeeded beyond measure. I convinced myself that I hated you, that you were everything shallow and mercenary. But I was lying to myself, because even when I thought I hated you, I could not stop thinking about you." Could not stop wondering if you were well, if you were happy, if you ever thought of me. I thought of you every day, Matilda whispered. Every single day. And when I found you in the snow, Julian said, his voice rough with emotion, when I saw you clutching that puppy, protecting him even as you were dying, I knew. I knew that the woman I had believed you to be could not exist. That the truth was something far more complicated. And when you told me what you had sacrificed to protect me, when I understood the depth of your love. He broke off, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. It shattered me, Matilda. The realization that you had loved me enough to destroy yourself. That I had wasted 2 years hating you when I should have been moving heaven and earth to find the truth. You could not have known, Matilda said, her hands coming up to clutch his coat. I made certain I should have known, Julian insisted. I should have trusted my heart instead of my wounded pride. And I swear to you, Matilda, I will regret that failure for the rest of my life. But I will not make the same mistake twice. I will not let you walk out of this house believing that I want you gone. Then what do you want? Matilda asked, barely able to speak past the hope and fear warring in her chest. Julian pulled back just enough to look at her, and what she saw in his eyes stole her breath. Not duty, not guilt, but something raw and honest and utterly devastating. I want you to stay, he said simply. I want to wake every morning knowing you are here. I want to watch you laugh with Mrs. Dawson and play with Pip. I want to argue with you about books and politics and whether the roses should be pruned in March or April. I want all the small, mundane, precious moments that make up a life. Julian, Matilda breathed, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break free of her chest. I want to court you properly, he continued. To give you time to heal and to know that you are choosing me freely, without obligation or gratitude clouding your judgment. And then, when you are ready, if you are ever ready, I want to ask you again the question I asked 2 years ago. And this time, I want the truth. Matilda could not stop the sob that escaped her, could not contain the overwhelming flood of emotion that crashed through her defenses. The truth is that I never stopped loving you. That I have loved you through lies and separation and all the years we lost. That I will love you until the day I die. Julian's eyes closed, and she felt the tremor that ran through him. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. Then stay, Matilda. Please. Stay and let me prove that I am worthy of that love. Stay and let me spend the rest of my life ensuring you never regret it. I could never regret you, she whispered. And then his lips were on hers, and the kiss was everything. Apology and promise, grief and joy. All the lost time and all the hope for the future distilled into a single moment of perfect understanding. Pip barked happily at their feet, his tail wagging with such enthusiasm that his entire body shook. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Julian smiled, truly smiled, for the first time since she had found her way back to him. I believe that is a yes, he asked. Matilda laughed through her tears. Yes, I will stay. Summer arrived with a gentleness that felt like grace. The hunting lodge, which had seemed so austere and cold when Matilda first arrived, half frozen and desperate, transformed into something that felt remarkably like home. The windows stood open to let in the warm breeze, carrying with it the scent of roses from the garden Mrs. Dawson had coaxed back to life. Pip had grown from a trembling puppy into a confident young dog who ruled the household with benevolent tyranny. and even the servants had stopped pretending to be annoyed by his presence. Matilda had stayed, as Julian asked, and in the months that followed, he had courted her with a patience and devotion that still sometimes took her breath away. He brought her books from London and read to her by the fire in the evenings. He walked with her through the countryside, Pip racing ahead to chase rabbits he had no hope of catching. He taught her to ride properly, laughing when she proved to be far more competent than he had expected. He introduced her to his friends and his family with a pride that made her cheeks flush and her heart swell. And slowly, carefully, the wounds they had both carried began to heal. They spoke of the past only when necessary, preferring instead to build something new from the rubble of what had been destroyed. Matilda learned that Julian had a wicked sense of humor beneath his ducal reserve, that he was hopeless at cards but brilliance at chess, that he sang slightly off-key when he thought no one was listening. Julian discovered that Matilda had opinions on everything from agricultural reform to the proper way to train terriers, that she was fiercely intelligent and utterly unimpressed by titles, that she smiled in her sleep when Pip curled against her side. They learned each other again, without lies, without pretense, and what they built was stronger than what had come before. It was on a golden evening in late June that Julian asked her to walk with him to the lake at the edge of his property. Pip trotted between them, occasionally veering off to investigate something fascinating in the undergrowth before bounding back with his tongue lolling happily. The lake was mirror still, reflecting the sky in shades of amber and rose as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Julian had arranged for a blanket to be spread beneath an old oak tree, and a basket of wine and cheese waited for them. Matilda laughed when she saw it. "You planned this." "I am a duke," Julian said, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Planning is what we do." They settled on the blanket, Pip immediately claiming the spot between them and rolling onto his back in shameless demand for attention. Julian obliged, scratching the dog's belly while Matilda poured the wine. "He has become quite spoiled," she observed. "He has earned it," Julian replied. "He kept you alive when I could not. I owe him a debt I can never fully repay." Matilda's throat tightened at the words, at the depth of feeling in Julian's voice when he spoke of the small terrier who had been her only companion in the darkest time of her life. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light change on the water, listening to the evening songs of birds settling into the trees. Pip eventually abandoned his quest for belly rubs and wandered down to the lake's edge to bark at his reflection. "Matilda," Julian said quietly, and something in his tone made her turn to look at him. He was watching her with an expression that was tender and nervous and utterly unguarded. "I have something I need to ask you." Her heart began to beat faster. "Julian, I know I said I would wait," he continued, reaching for her hand. "I promised to give you time to heal, to ensure you were choosing freely. And I have tried to be patient. But Matilda, I have waited 2 years already. 2 years believing I hated you, when in truth I loved you so desperately I could not bear to acknowledge it. And I find I cannot wait any longer." He shifted, moving from the blanket to kneel on the grass before her, and Matilda's breath caught in her chest. 2 years ago, I asked you to marry me, and you refused with words that cut me to the bone," Julian said, his gray eyes holding hers with unwavering intensity. "I know now that those words were lies, spoken to protect me from a threat I never truly faced. I know that you sacrificed everything, your happiness, your safety, your future, because you loved me enough to let me go." Tears blurred Matilda's vision, but she could not look away. "I cannot change those 2 years," Julian continued, his voice thick with emotion. I cannot give you back the time we lost or erase the pain you endured. But I can promise you that every day forward will be different. That I will spend the rest of my life proving that you were right to love me, even when I was too foolish to see it. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box. When he opened it, the ring inside caught the fading sunlight, a sapphire the color of winter twilight, surrounded by small diamonds that sparkled like stars. "Lady Matilda Vance," Julian said, and his voice trembled just slightly. "I loved you when I thought I hated you. I loved you when I believed you were everything cruel and mercenary. I loved you through lies and truth, through separation and reunion, through every moment of the past 2 years. And I will love you for every moment of all the years to come." Pip chose that moment to return from the lake, shaking water all over them both and inserting himself between Julian and Matilda with a happy bark. Julian laughed, a sound of pure joy, and reached out to ruffle the dog's damp fur. "And you, sir," he said to Pip, "are the bravest soul I have ever known. You protected her when I could not, and for that, you have earned a place of honor in whatever household we build together. I promise to provide you with the finest scraps, the warmest cushions, and all the belly rubs your small heart desires." Pip's tail wagged with such vigor that his entire body wiggled, and he licked Julian's face with enthusiastic approval. Matilda was crying openly now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she watched the man she loved make promises to the puppy who had saved her life. Julian turned his attention back to her, his own eyes bright with emotion. "So I ask you now, Matilda, with no lies between us and no threats hanging over our heads, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me? Will you let me love you the way you have always deserved to be loved?" For a moment, Matilda could not speak. The words caught in her throat, tangled with too much feeling to express. But then she found her voice, and when she spoke, it was clear and certain and full of all the love she had carried for so long. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Julian. 1,000 times, yes." He surged forward, catching her in his arms and kissing her with a fierce tenderness that spoke of promises kept and futures claimed. Pip barked joyfully around them, dancing in circles until Julian broke the kiss long enough to scoop the dog into his arms as well, holding both Matilda and Pip in an embrace that felt like the truest definition of family. When Julian finally released them to slide the ring onto Matilda's finger, his hands were shaking. The sapphire settled against her skin as though it had always belonged there, a perfect fit, a perfect promise. "It was my grandmother's," Julian said softly. "She was the strongest woman I ever knew before I met you. She would have loved you." "I wish I could have known her," Matilda whispered. "You will," Julian said. "Through me. Through the stories I will tell our children. Through the legacy we will build together. Our children." The words painted a future so bright and beautiful that Matilda felt her heart might burst with the hope of it. They stayed by the lake until the stars emerged, talking of all the dreams they had buried and could now finally claim. They spoke of where they would live, the London townhouse for the season, perhaps, and a country estate for the rest of the year where Pip could run and children could play. They spoke of travel and books and all the small adventures that made up a life well lived. And when the night grew too cold to remain outside, Julian helped Matilda to her feet, and they walked back to the lodge hand in hand, Pip trotting ahead with the satisfied air of a dog who had orchestrated the entire affair. Mrs. Dawson met them at the door with a knowing smile and a bottle of champagne she had clearly been keeping chilled for precisely this occasion. The household staff gathered in the hall, their faces bright with genuine happiness. And toasts were offered, and laughter echoed through rooms that had once been cold and silent. That night, Matilda stood at the window of her chamber and looked out at the moonlit landscape. Pip was already asleep on the bed, snoring softly, exhausted from the day's excitement. She touched the ring on her finger, feeling the weight of it, the promise of it. Behind her, the door opened quietly. She turned to find Julian in the doorway, his expression soft in the candlelight. "I could not sleep," he admitted. "I kept thinking this might be a dream, that I would wake and find you gone." Matilda crossed to him and took his hand, bringing it to rest over her heart. "I am here," she said simply. "I am real, and I am yours, Julian, for as long as you will have me." "Forever, then," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And even that will not be long enough." They stood together in the doorway, neither quite willing to let the other go, bound by love that had survived lies and cruelty and all the forces that had tried to tear them apart. And in the bed behind them, Pip, the loyal, brave, ridiculous terrier who had been there from the beginning, dreamed of summer days and endless belly rubs and the humans who loved him. The blizzard that had nearly killed them was long past. Spring had come and gone. Summer blazed with promise, and ahead of them stretched a future built not on duty or guilt or noble sacrifice, but on the simple, powerful truth that love, real love, was worth fighting for, worth dying for, worth living for, always. My lovely family, Matilda's story didn't end in the snow. It didn't end with her father's cruelty. It ended with love, protection, and the family she chose. But here's the thing. Stories like this almost never get told because they don't go viral. They don't trend. They just quietly disappear unless people like you share them. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that love is worth fighting for, then please share it. Send it to someone who needs to hear that broken things can be made whole again. Subscribe so you never miss another story, because these characters deserve to be remembered. And so do you. Thank you for being here. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.